It's the Fantasy Football Hustle. Here are your hosts, Brian Drake and Dwain McFarland.
Chris Carson. I think he's a guy who gets forgotten about when we start talking about running backs and what they can provide for you in terms of value in your draft. Last year, he was running back 11 in a half-point PPR. All right, he's going off the board now at running back 16. You can get him at the end of the third round. He avoided hip surgery in the offseason. Yes, they brought in Carlos Hyde, but they've admitted he's going to be a backup. Penny blew out his ACL in December, so he's going to have a while to be sitting on the shelf. Here's the bottom line with Chris Carson. They're going to pound the rock. This guy's going to give you 1,000 yards and 7+ touchdowns. That's what he does. He's not a zero in the passing game. And you see as the chart here, averaged 16 points per game. And he was only an RB1 3 of 15 games played. Is that great? No, it's not. But 40% of the time, he's an RB2. That's what you're drafting him for.
You 60% of the time. Yeah, 60% of the time, you get better. You get RB2 or better.
Yeah.
He's
a solid guy.
Yeah.
I just landed him in the Scott Fish Bowl, I think, as my RB3 or 4. People just forget about this guy. I couldn't believe it. So Chris Carson, fantastic opportunity in Seattle. The team is going to be good. You know he's going to be on the field, and they're just going to put the ball in his belly and let him rock and roll.
Yeah, so for Carson, I mean, you nailed it. I mean, you can see the 3 games where he topped the 25, point mark. He's never one of these guys, Drake, that is going to explode for 40. It just doesn't really happen. Seattle will mix some other guys in. But the good news is, like you said, they're so run heavy. If you look at what, the Seahawks do, I mean, he's in a great situation. I mean, they'll try to run the ball as much as they can. If they can run the ball 50% of snaps, they will. Last year, I believe they were 52-48 from a pass run split, which is very, that's from a league average standpoint. Typically, you're around 56-44, 57-43 is typically the league average from an attempt perspective and the way the splits go down. So he's on a team that's one of the much more run heavy teams in the league. And so that works out for him. And if you look at him, I mean, it's like you said, you see this consistency that he gets. The other thing that I like here is, you notice even in these, you'll notice a lot of these games, look how many games they keep it close where they don't have to drop back a lot. That's just how they manage these games in Seattle. And they always keep it this way. You just don't see a bunch of these spikes where, they do have a few times where they get blown out, right? And in those games, those are where you're seeing him drop down here below this. And it isn't really because his role is changing. He's staying on the field. They just don't pass a ton to the running backs, right? And they just had to run less in those games. But any game where they're keeping it close or it's within range, which they do quite often, he ends up being a great play for you. So their defense is going to take a little bit of a hit this year, so that hurts him some. But if we look at all of his from a percentage of snaps played, he's always in this solid territory. Again, you see where they had to drop back and pass 71% of the time. The snaps drop down here. You see these two over here. These actually they use 3 backs in these weeks.
Weeks
12 and 13. Yeah. And week 11, he actually, I don't remember if that one is actually the bye week or the week he missed, but he did have a week that he missed. So, but again, for the most part, his snaps are solid. If we think about this, they added Carlos Hyde, right? I'm not really worried about Carlos Hyde. I think that's more around Rashad Penny. When you've listened, like you said, all the reports on his hip are positive that he'll be ready to go for week 1. So I'm proceeding as if, that's going to be the case. If we look at his rushing attempts, again, look at this. Every single week, Drake, except for 2, he at least hit an RB2 threshold for his rushing attempts. And that's due to the way that the Seahawks want to play the game. Even if the Seahawks, all of a sudden, their defense is really bad this year, like at the most, I think you're going to see, Drake, like would they go to a 55 pass, 45 run, right? I think that's the furthest you'll see them. You'll never see them just turn into like a 62% pass like you will see some teams, right? 38 run when they're getting blown out. Because they believe that their game is built off of big plays, and they believe to have those big plays, they have to have the rushing game intact. Now, it's debatable how many times you need to run the ball a game to make the defense respect play action and those things. Probably not as much as the Seahawks think, but regardless, that's the way they play the game. And so if we look at, the percentage of rushing attempts, In the games where he was healthy last year, Drake, he averaged 63% on the year, on the season. He was a little bit lower than that, but when you take out those games where he, left the game early or he was dinged during the game. So when he was healthy, 63% of the attempts. If you look at, what he gets inside, the 5, last year it was 45%, but again, he had some games missed. The year before he was at 76% of the carries inside the 5. I expect this to be one of those players that's going to get 60% plus of the carries, and he's going to get over 60% of the attempts inside the 5. This is one of those teams that they don't necessarily use Russell Wilson a ton inside the 5 like some of the other teams with mobile quarterbacks do, and it was actually even less last year. I think Russell Wilson, his numbers as far as being used in those high leverage situations has actually gone down, over the last few years. So that's a good thing for Chris Carson. So I think Chris Carson, when I look at Chris Carson right now, I'm pretty excited about him. Even his routes ran, yeah, he has these dips, but like you said, he's not a zero. He's not a zero. Early in the year, they were passing a little bit more to the running backs. Again, now we've got these raw numbers down here instead of percentages. But you can see he's getting to that RB2 number enough when you factor in the attempts that we just talked about, right? Now, the thing you'll notice is they're getting blown out, and he's not the guy getting these, routes. What they're trying to do is go further downfield, right? And he's having to stay in to block. It's not necessarily that he's leaving, the field all the time. He did lose some snaps during that game, but he's just not a huge part of the passing game. But I think you nailed it earlier when you said he's not a zero. And so when I look at, Chris Carson, I don't see a lot of negatives. I don't even think Carlos Hyde signing is really a negative. You got Rashad Penny, with a blown out ACL, who's probably not going to be ready for week 1. Carlos Hyde is actually recovering himself. So when I look at Chris Carson, this is a guy I don't mind targeting, Drake, and I've seen him fall past this round. So if I take a runner in the first round and I want to take a stud receiver or stud tight end in the second round, and I want to make sure I have 2 runners after that going into round 3, Chris Carson is one of the few runners in that 3rd round to 4th round, and I love him in the 4th round. You got him, in the 6th round or 5th round of Scott Fishbowl? Yeah. I think that's an absolute steal at that point. But he's on target for his return. He's on a run-heavy team. There aren't any passing down specialists Carlos Hyde isn't a passing down specialist. CJ Prosise probably won't make the team. Rashad Penny is decent in the passing game, but he's not a specialist, and he's hurt. So I just see Carson as one of the guys that I'm with you. I think he's being undervalued right now. I think where he's being taken right now, 35 overall, is probably about the right spot just due to how many good, we've got some really good receivers going in the 3rd round. But overall, Carson's one guy, Drake, where I wouldn't mind if I just wanted to do something contrarian and I want to build let's say I get down to pick 10 and I don't want to take Joe Mixon or Josh Jacobs or Nick Chubb or one of those guys and say Kenyon Drake, a guy we talked about who we like, is gone. I might take Devontae Adams if he's there, turn around, take Travis Kelce in the 2nd round, come back, take Carson in the 3rd round. I'm going to have a unique team, especially if I'm playing in a big tournament style season long like FFPC or NFFC, something like that. I think that's a viable, situation. Yeah, he has been dinged. He's missed a couple of games here and there. So you're going to have to watch for that. But I don't see a clear threat to take his job away. And I don't see a clear threat for the offense just to totally change. So I think he's a good guy to potentially build a different type of roster with in those situations.
Dwain over at Pro Football Focus has Chris Carson as running back 17. Something you also want to think about, a lot of these guys we're going to talk about today, and Fournette and Carson fit into this, are guys who are on the final year of their contract. They're playing for money for next year. That's always an incentive for these guys. And it also could mean these teams are going to just run the wheels off them. So it's not necessarily like, oh, we're going to try to save Chris Carson. He could be gone after this year. They don't care. They could pound him for a bazillion carries. It doesn't really matter. So just be mindful of that as we go along, and I'll try to pinpoint some of the guys who are on the final year of their deal.